As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
More rewards, more savings. With American Express Business Gold, earn up to $395 back in annual statement credits on eligible purchases at select shipping, food delivery, and retail subscription merchants, including the $155 Walmart Plus monthly membership credit and $240 flexible business credit. Enjoy the benefits of membership with the Amex Business Gold Card. Terms apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/business-gold. Amex Business Gold Card. Built for business by American Express.
Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-844-4-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and with Red Bull making yet another driver change, we ask if Max Verstappen is flattering the team and what it says about its technical troubles. I'm Edd Straw, and join me to tackle that topic, evaluate how Yuki Tsunoda will fare at Suzuka, and tackle another batch of your questions are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Nelson Valkenburg. Well, Nelson, welcome back to the podcast. Of course, listeners will know you as the Dutch TV commentator for Viaplay, and for some reason we thought you might have some interesting things to say about Red Bull and Max Verstappen, and it's quite early in the season for all that nonsense, isn't it?
Earlier than we've ever thought it would happen, I guess, but it's been a very Dutch media-centric week, I suppose. The Dutch media broke the news the first, but it's an insane week, but I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, well, there's plenty we're going to be able to get into on this. And Scott, you're having a little bit of a break. I think this is one of your few working appointments of today. You've had to go into seclusion and retreat to a remote part of Sweden after the madness of the past week.
Yeah, we've headed north for a long weekend, and as you say, a day off starts with recording a podcast. So days off aren't really days off anymore. But in a week like this, what do you expect? It's just continued this unexpectedly rapid fire cadence to the season. You know, the double header, Australia and China, fun weekends, lots going on, and then just days of not just speculation, because obviously it wasn't just making stuff up and seeing what happened. It was all being written and talked about for a reason. So that's. Red Bull have definitely kept things interesting. I think it just felt like maybe they thought it was maybe they needed to distract from what was happening on track and some of the stuff Max was saying and whatnot. Point the finger somewhere else.
Well, we are not going to get distracted because although we're going to talk about the driver change, we're actually going to start elsewhere and look a little bit more at what might be the core of the problems at the team. Because Nelson, obviously, the struggles that Liam Lawson had, they're symptomatic of the problems Red Bull has with its car. What do you make of the step taken with the RB21 this year? And is Max Verstappen's brilliance the only thing that's keeping this team's head above water?
Yes, it seems like we've got these two very weird pieces of a puzzle and that magically fit together with Verstappen. And he isn't always a second and a half quicker than his teammates. But in this particular car, that with this DNA, this Red Bull DNA, it becomes a whole different matter. But the perception is that it's made for Verstappen and he doesn't like it either. He thinks he could go quicker if the car would have been a little bit more forgiving, if it's less understeering mid-corner, or doesn't snap to oversteer when he tries to go on throttle. So he's not happy, but he's just the only one who's able to make it work. And I think that has bamboozled Red Bull a lot over the last few years.
Yeah, and I think it's important to differentiate because there's two things going on. Because people often say, oh, the Red Bull's designed around Verstappen and it's got that pointiness he wants. And like you saw with driver like Michael Schumacher in the past, that's a phenomenally quick way to have a racing car, but also very difficult and requires a great driver to deal with it. But that's not where Red Bull is at the moment, is it, Scott? They've got a car that's not doing what Verstappen does, but because he's got that amazing ability, the way he manipulates the car in the braking zone, the way he loads up the front tyres and unloads it, and he gives himself what he can from the car to be able to extract some performance from it. And this is what Liam Lawson couldn't get anywhere near. So this isn't a question of a car that's designed around Verstappen, that's what he wants, that others can't drive. It's about a Red Bull that's not working well, that only he can make the best of so far. Yeah,
so I would say that there are kind of two specific things that have gone on over the last few years. First, you have the fact that Max's performance ceiling is so high and what he can tolerate from a car is so fantastic that it encourages Red Bull to go down a development route or have the car behave in a certain way that it wouldn't be able to do without a driver that could handle that. So you have a sort of natural Red Bull development philosophy that we might slightly broadly characterize as pursuing maximum downforce, maximum load, maximum theoretical performance without having to worry too much about drivability, car handling characteristics, how user-friendly the car is. That is a balance that all teams have to strike. And I think different teams have tripped up on that at different times in terms of some teams in the past have found amazing numbers in the wind tunnel and then put the car on the track and found that it has an incredibly narrow window. And you'll hear so often this year, last year, whatever, Red Bull drivers talking about the narrow window of the car. So I think that that's sort of what Red Bull has done generally, because it's been emboldened to do that by the fact that Max could handle the sort of negative sides of that. And I think that goes hand in hand with the fact that they will obviously take Max's feedback on board. Yes, you can put more front end into this car. I want more front end on this car. I can handle more front end on this car. So Red Bull goes that way with it as well, and then expects the other driver to be able to keep up because Max is able to turn that into fantastic lap times, into fantastic performances, and so on. So these two things aren't entirely independent, but one doesn't also mean that the car is built around Verstappen. I think the best way to describe that side of things will always be to go back to how Alex Albon's put it in the past when he says, if anyone's ever played a video game and you turn the controller sensitivity up to maximum, and all of a sudden the thing is just absolutely flying around. It feels like you could sometimes with these Red Bulls, it feels like you could go into the corner and just sort of flick the rear tyre going in and the rear would come round because it's so on the nose. I think that's not just because that's what Max wants. It's that and some other traits are partly because that's what the Red Bull development philosophy ultimately, I think, leads to in a car.
And I think until Imola, Miami last year, they could get away with it. And suddenly they couldn't. And from that moment on, Verstappen's been very vocal within the team to say, this is the wrong path we're on. We're not going to be able to keep up. And it's all coming to fruition. It's happening in front of our eyes right now.
Yeah, well, it ends up with two consequences, doesn't it? Or two things that trip it up. You either get to the point where even Max can't live with all of the traits that come with the car, or you don't have a performance advantage anymore. So when you fall out of that window, you're punished a lot more greatly. And you see now Max is in a point where 2 Grand Prix weekends and a sprint race. Max can't win with this car yet. Even Max cannot win with this car. And it's been a long time. I wouldn't be surprised if he does win races this season, but you have to go back a long way for Max Verstappen to not be winning Grand Prix. So then when you have to take that on board, right? Like if Max is able to absolutely dominate a season in a good Red Bull and his teammate only wins 1 or 2 races and ultimately gets sacked because the performance isn't there to support a Constructors' Championship bid, a la Checo last year, what is the other driver going to do when Max can't even win a single race in that Red Bull? You know, I'm not saying it's that drastic at the moment, but you do have to sort of factor in that wider context, as Nelson put it at the start. If this car is built for Max, then even that's something Red Bull's failed at because Max doesn't like the car.
It's been interesting to plot the trajectory of Max Verstappen's comments this year, because in testing he was talking about, yeah, it's much better than last year, yeah, something we can work with. And that didn't entirely match what we were seeing from trackside and what the onboards were showing. And I feel like kind of with each day of running this year, he's just got very fractionally more negative because, you know, he's honest when he's asked for feedback. And I sense there's some frustration there. And I guess you've got to ask, Nelson, is there a problem with overall the technical direction they're taking? Obviously, Adrian Newey left. His influence was waning even before he committed to leave to go to Aston Martin. There were some things about the car he didn't like. And this is very much the kind of next generation Red Bull technical team's chance, isn't it? It's Pierre Vacher, the technical director's opportunity. And it feels like they have thought some small fixes to last year's car, along with maybe bringing in a little bit of the flexible aero that they felt wasn't acceptable last year, but others were doing, would be enough to fix everything. But it hasn't, has it?
No, and when you say Newey, I would also add Rob Marshall in that conversation, because I think his departure has left a bigger hole than Newey, who was half in, half out at the point when he left the team. It feels, when I look at the way Red Bull approaches things, a little bit like 2022 with Mercedes. Just saying our base concept is right, but external factors are making sure that we cannot really get the maximum out of it. And if we tweak it a little bit, then we're there. And it never worked for Mercedes. It never worked, even though they came to every race, every season with big expectations. They had to really look at themselves. And they're still not there. Huh? It's still not the fastest car. And it seems from the outside that the Vacher-led team very much believes in its own concept, because we've been successful with it before. And if we just make some tweaks, and if we can stop others using this very annoying and illegal flexi wing advantage that they have, then we're going to be there. If nobody has flexi wings, then we're there. And it's just not working like that.
I'd be very interested to see exactly how much accountability Red Bull does ultimately take with where the car's at, the struggles that the drivers are having, the extent of the Lawson issues. Because when they made the announcement that Tsunoda would replace Lawson, they made a point of saying that that Tsunoda's experience would assist in the development of the car, which obviously has been taken by some people, not unfairly, because I did think this as well, is like Red Bull holding their hands up and saying, look, we know that the car's not right. And it's a continuation of everything we've heard from pre-season testing. You know, Vacher was quoted in the team's own press release at testing that they hadn't made the steps with the car that they wanted. But I would just caution that interpretation slightly, because the more I thought about it, the more I was thinking, like, I wonder what Max thinks about this. I wonder what Max thinks about the suggestion that they need Yuki in the car to assist with the development. Because Verstappen's been saying for ages that they've got problems in the car. Why? This is the thing. I understand that two different voices picking up on different things can perhaps help, but they haven't even been able to make the progress that Verstappen feels has been necessary with the specific feedback that he has been offering. So I just don't see, and this is no disrespect to Yuki at all, because I think it's more about Red Bull sort of justifying it after the fact. I don't see how Yuki can be the missing link in terms of that development. So then on the point of accountability, how much are Red Bull genuinely looking at themselves and thinking, okay, this is the problem area, this is what we don't understand, this is where we've gone wrong, and how much is it still finding just a little bit of being like, we haven't actually had everything we need to to fix this car in its entirety. And I just don't think that chimes with the way that Verstappen wants things to work, because we know what he can get like and how he can feel if the perception is that not everyone in the team's on the same wavelength. Remember not just the outburst in the Hungarian Grand Prix last year, but the comments to the media afterwards. That was the point where his relationship with Red Bull felt really, really frayed. And he's doing a very good job of putting a brave face on it in public at the moment. But I think that's partly coming from him almost self-censoring to a degree. I think he's being very, very sensible at keeping his sort of mouth shut a little bit and just not answering questions as freely as he otherwise might, because I think if he wanted to speak his mind, he would, and I don't think he'd say particularly nice things. And I suspect Nelson is better placed to judge on this, that I imagine that's sort of still the case in his native language interviews, because he's always been more open to Dutch media, hasn't he? But it feels like even there he's still a bit reserved.
He is extremely reserved. We're all a little bit flabbergasted by, especially in front of a camera, the answers we're getting. But it seems like he's just decided, okay, this is the season I'm having to deal with. I'm going to deal with it by keeping all my cards close to my vest, only speaking with a very small circle within the team, it feels like, but very focused, because even though the car isn't a car you can actually win with, I think he was the top scorer in the China race rankings at the race, and he's second in the championship. He is driving at such a high level that he's almost making a mockery of the car and of the people that build it.
Yeah, this is the thing. I think there's a consistent pattern with Red Bull of Verstappen being able to paper over the cracks. And I just wonder if there's enough realism in the team to recognise what's going on. Because it's clear Max is frustrated. Or he certainly was last year when he talked about the fact he'd been giving feedback about the car was or wasn't doing, and it wasn't being taken seriously because he was so good at extracting the most from it. So it's really interesting to wonder where his mindset is, isn't it, Nelson? Because there's always a question mark about what's he going to do in the future. Is he just going to sit in with Red Bull for the next 18 months or so, see how next year's engines work, and then he can jump ship for 27? Is he thinking of moving for 26? Is he keeping quiet because it's not in his interest to build up a big, what Fred Vasseur would say, a big polemic on everything? He's just able to just play the game that he wants to. Does he want changes in Red Bull because he's not convinced that the way he's working? There's a lot of potential things that could be going on with Max, or it could even just be, couldn't it, that he is just thinking, well, okay, I'll make the best of it. I'm quite happy just to sit here and do what I do. But that doesn't sound very Max Verstappen to me.
I don't think he gets in his plane, to go to a Grand Prix with the idea, I'm going to finish fourth, but I did the best I could. I don't think that appeals to him whatsoever. He wants to win, he wants to dominate, he wants to lead by 20, 25 seconds, and if he has the odd race like in Brazil last year, that'll satisfy that. But that's not the season he has, and for the foreseeable future, he's not going to have it. But seeing what kind of changes can you put in, who is available. Over the past 2-3 years, so many big names have left Red Bull that it almost feels like a junior team again. There's so many new faces. And the fact that they changed Lawson for Yuki Tsunoda, it just makes no sense. And I believe it also makes no sense to Max Verstappen. And Scott, you pointed this out to me yesterday, is that we've had a very large and actually well-balanced post from former F1 driver Guido van der Garde, a Viaplay contributor, an analyst. And one of the first people who liked it was Max. And that was a little bit painful.
It's just on the off chance that that hasn't been noticed by people. One, I would urge people to find Guido's Instagram and look at it. But I'll Ed, is it worth me just reading it out very quickly? It's not a particularly long post. I just think it's worth hearing it in full, if you don't mind.
Yeah, just don't do your Dutch accent when you do it.
No, I'm not going to. He says, I'm getting a bit tired of all the comments that F1 is the toughest sport in terms of performances. And when you under-deliver, you've got to face the consequences. Yes, you've got to perform. Yes, the pressure is insane. But in my opinion, this comes closer to bullying or a panic move than actual high athlete achievements. They made a decision, fully aware, gave Liam 2 races only to crush his spirit. Don't forget the dedication, hard work and success Liam has put in his career so far to achieve the level where he is now. I remember my own blood, sweat and tears, and that was to reach F1, let alone driving for an absolute top team. Yes, he underperformed the first 2 races, but if anyone's aware of that, it's himself. Perhaps he has suggested this himself, but if not, I wish Liam all the strength and courage to get to the grid in Japan. Trust yourself, get your head up, prove them wrong. And the reason I read that out in full is because, and I've noticed a couple of people who are perhaps a bit defensive of Red Bull flag this, there are a lot of different strands to that. And what Max is liking, you could argue, could be the sentiment as a whole that, oh, this is unfortunate for Liam, but, come back stronger. I'm not convinced. I think there's too much of that. The fact is that the general tone of that message is critical of the decision and the way they've handled it. I don't think it's unfair to interpret Max liking that as an indication that it reflects his position. But to go back about 10 years or so, in the sort of more heyday era of Twitter, likes don't equal endorsements, retweets don't equal endorsements. So maybe we shouldn't read too much into it.
There's a lot in what Gedo Vandergaard said there that I agree with. When you look at what they've done, because the argument of, well, performance is everything and you've got to deliver to hang on to your seat is one I subscribe to. But not.
That was the Perez argument. But that's why Perez was legitimate at the end of his career.
He had 4 years. But
to
give somebody pre-season testing of a day and a half
on
which you had technical problems, and then you give them 2 race weekends, one in which he lost FP3 to a technical problem, and then a sprint weekend, and then say, oh, no, we're not seeing signs of improvement, you're going nowhere, is idiocy. To me, I don't think you can possibly defend it without saying that the initial decision to put him in was so ludicrously ill-founded that you've just got to roll back on it. And to me, this is what concerns me about Red Bull. It's a very, very good team. They do so much right, but I just worry, Nelson, that this is just symptomatic of a team that doesn't really have a good handle on its decision-making and what it needs to be doing. And I wonder if that's starting to extend to the technical side. And actually, this is a team that's getting progressively weaker. And probably the bit that you will see fade last will be trackside operation, where they're still phenomenally good, because that's kind of the last thing that will be affected by this kind of rot that seems to be there. Do you think, is that a little bit of an overstatement, or do you think there could be something like that going on, something rotten in the state of Red Bull?
Well, this decision for a driver change is just papering over the cracks again. It's just not allowing you to say, okay, we built a difficult car. No, it's the driver's fault, so he has to go. So it leaves them in an interesting position. And indeed, the team still functions very well on track. And the way they execute, at least on the side of Verstappen's garage, because last year in Perez's case, there were a few iffy moments. But we've lost Wheatley at Red Bull. I think the one who's holding that up right now is Paul Monahan within trackside operations. And if he goes, if he's unhappy, then that's a true rot. Right now, I think the race team's fine. It's everything around it, management, the design, where there are problems.
This is what I was sort of getting at when I said about accountability, because the technical organisation, we know that with all of the Adrian Newey stuff last year, but also over previous years, Horner has been a big advocate of Vacher. He has backed him. He has lent on Vacher as the reason why losing Newey is not actually that big a deal, And Marco kind of acts as we know. There's between the two of them, frankly, there's sort of nothing they can do, it seems, that results in sort of the buck stopping with them. It just always feels like they act ultimately without consequence. Marco on the driver's side, Horner with team decisions, and obviously other stuff that's happened and ongoing. And it feels a little bit like, why wouldn't that extend to the technical team as well? Because ultimately, that if everybody is sort of covering their backs to a greater or lesser extent, or immune to any kind of consequence, then I think that's going to seep into other areas of the organisation. The only way I see it sort of changing is if it gets to the point where Horner, for example, can't can't have his position undermined by the fact that technical teams are underperforming, because he's the one that's backed Vacher, and therefore if Vacher is not leading the team properly or unable to find solutions, if the Verstappen camp turns on Vacher and starts lobbying against him, for example, what's Horner gonna have to do for his own position, but also the good of the team? On the driver's side, it's very difficult to unpick something like this and picking Lawson in the first place from the long history of Marco making driver choices on whims and without scrutiny and stuff like that. And we know that there was a lot of sort of back and forth between Horner and Marco and ultimately the stakeholders within Red Bull on who was the right choice. There wasn't really a unanimous position, and this is being presented now as this change as a unanimous position, but it's hard to really know for sure, because it's always just so murky around the decision making, and trying to identify logic where there might not be one could well be a fool's errand.
I was amused by some of the justification. I've seen Helmut Marko said, Yuki Tsunoda's a new driver this year. And you kind of think, well, A, it's 2 races, and B, he had a strong year last year. And if anything, the inconsistency that Tsunoda had last year was more down to the team than anything else. And I just don't see how you can slice and dice it to make it a logical decision other than just we've decided to make a change because things aren't going well. It's a really messy situation. I can't help but agree that it reflects there's still political problems in terms of the leadership of that team. We're kind of in the post Dietrich Mateschitz era of Red Bull, aren't we? And it just has not settled down, even if there's periods of superficial calm.
And the funny thing about this all is that the big winner might be Liam Lawson. If he just gets into a car that actually works the way we think the Racing Bulls car works, and he now has a full season to probably out-qualify Hadjar, although Hadjar is driving well, and maybe outperform on a consistent basis the car he just vacated, he'll be fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was always sceptical as to whether Lawson was the right solution for Red Bull. I'm a little bit doubtful about his ultimate potential, but I do think he's a perfectly capable, good Grand Prix driver, and I'm sure he'll do a decent job in Racing Bulls.
This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was getting frustrated by your forms. Now, Taxes is uploading your forms with a snap, and a TurboTax expert will do your taxes for you. One who's backed by the latest tech, which cross-checks millions of data points for absolute accuracy, all of which makes it easy for you to get the most money back, guaranteed. Get an expert now at TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantees.
So good, so good, so good.
Get ready, because Clear the Rack is on at your Nordstrom Rack store. Now through Monday, find incredible deals on Wear Now styles. On sale for even less at Nordstrom Rack. Take an extra 25% off red tag clearance throughout the store from brands like Adidas, Marc Jacobs, Steve Madden, and more. All sales final. The best stuff goes fast. So shop this sale at Nordstrom Rack today. Please see NordstromRack.com or ask a store associate for details.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Right, Scott, let's talk about Yuki Tsunoda now. He's basically had a few days to get used to being a Red Bull Racing driver, prepare for the switch. He's got a show run in Tokyo on Wednesday. He's got to get a tune out of the RB21 immediately amid the pressure of the home fans. Can he make
it?
Yeah, that's the small task list. Can he make it work, or do you agree with those who argue he's doomed to fail?
I don't think he's doomed to fail, because first of all, that's not how any situation works. It's not how sport works, and it's not how F1 works. Yuki has to be closer to a Verstappen level driver than a Lawson Perez level driver to make it work, I think. But I believe he is a faster driver. I think he is closer. I think he could be closer to Verstappen than the other two. I think his ceiling is very exciting. It's the oscillations in performance and execution that have always been sort of the main thing that Yuki needs to work on. the worry I have with it is beyond even the specifics of this has inherently been a doomed job and the car still is difficult. Lawson's just struggled way more and way more quickly than anybody would have expected. And Tsunoda's going into that situation with one hand tied behind his back because they haven't given him pre-season. That's the thing that I don't understand. Like, you've made a decision that basically means Lawson gets the full run up to the year. He's embedded within the team. He's doing the simulator work at the factory. He's done the preseason test as limited as it ended up being. He started the season, all of that. You've taken all of that away from Tsunoda just to chuck him in early in the season. So Lawson's not got any of the benefit of what you've given him in the winter. Tsunoda's got all of the disadvantages of a mid-season switch, and you've given it no time to play out whatsoever. So if he goes in and makes an impact immediately in Japan, I don't think we could talk highly enough of the quality that will take. And I also think that naturally should buy him a bit of time. The problem is, this is Red Bull. They've just dropped a driver after 2 races. So if they weren't going to give Lawson time, I don't know how much time they're going to give Tsunoda. I think he's got good potential, obviously. And there was talk at the end of last year when he did the test. He felt like actually that Red Bull suited him really well. He sort of conveyed almost a sense of surprise that given all of the talk about how difficult it was, he thought it might take a bit more adapting in that test than it did. But that's one test, unrepresentative conditions. You're not 100% sure what you're doing performance-wise. And it's always when you're chasing those final tenths that any of the evils in the car will come out.
The thing I'm interested in with Tsunoda is I do think he's got several positives on his side in that he's got a decent amount of experience. I think that period he had with Daniel Ricciardo as teammate will have helped him because Yuki's a driver who really likes to brake late. He's a late braking driver, and Pierre Gasly was that as well. And Tsunoda said in the past, "Oh, nobody brakes as hard as me." And he's talked about a couple of things. Well, he's talked about one thing, which is that Ricciardo was showing him there was a lot more to learn in terms of how he releases the brake to give you the car response you want. And the other thing is that Ricciardo also did a little bit of setup work. There was a little bit more about what I might call a slightly more three-dimensional approach to braking and how that's impacting the car dynamic as well. So although Ricciardo wasn't doing brilliantly, I think that has helped Tsunoda to broaden his toolkit as a driver, which I think is one thing that means he's in a better position to make this work than he would have been with, say, sort of 2-3 years experience under his belt. So he's got a bit about him, Tsunoda. And the thing I like, Nelson, is that at least he wants this chance. He believes he can make it work. And although it's tough, I wouldn't put it past him to actually succeed, even though everything is against him in terms of the circumstances.
But the big question is, what does success look like? If Verstappen qualifies 4/10 of pole and you give Tsunoda another 4/10, say that, then he's already deep in Q2, almost on going out on Q1 because the field is so condensed. So what does success look like for Japan and after that?
I think he needs to be Q3 fringes. He can't be going out in Q1. But if he's basically if he's the wrong side of a 1/10 divide, of getting into Q3, as long as that's not 9/10 off, you know what I mean? As long as there's not a massive field spread, and Max is 2/10 off pole, Yuki's 7/10 back and not getting into Q3. But if he's 3 or 4/10 off Max straight out the box and almost getting into Q3, that's a foundation. That can't then be sustained for the whole season because then you're just in the same place as before. The one thing I would say is if Tsunoda isn't matching Verstappen or very close to Verstappen over the course of however long he's given at Red Bull, I think one of the consequences would be that we probably need to slightly reappraise the job that Perez did. In that Perez, I still think at the end of the 4 years, it was right to make a change. But if Lawson comes into the car and is immediately over a second off, if Tsunoda's in the car and can't get within 3/10 of Verstappen, then suddenly, those Perez weekends where he was miles off and out in Q1 and Verstappen was putting it on pole or on the front row, whatever, it doesn't change that those weekends were bad. But I do think you would look a little bit more kindly on the job Perez did overall. Just when actually, given what's going on right now, we kind of understand it a little bit more, because it will be emphatic proof that it's not just a driver thing. And while a lot of us have known that this is a multi-dimensional situation, it wasn't just that Perez was rubbish, and now it's not just that the car's crap. It's never just one of these things. How you view these things does shift as you get more information. And the fact is, we're about to have a second driver post-Perez go into the Red Bull already.
And that would make it an extremely expensive mistake if we come to the conclusion that Perez was of the same caliber, maybe a little bit better than Yuki and Liam. But you say there is little patience at Red Bull. Where do they go after this? If Yuki doesn't work, are they going to promote Lindblad out of F2? After a handful of races? That's not going to happen. Are they going to try and get Colapinto? Where that would mean that Yuki's on the sidelines for the remainder of the season. So they have nowhere to go after this. This has to work some way.
And I think they've got to modify their strategy somewhat and think about partly the timelines with their driver development, the choices that are going into their driver development program. They have changed that a little bit because you've got Guillaume Rocky, who was Sebastian Vettel's race engineer. They're doing a lot of work, effectively leading that now, but it's still Helmut Marko's project as well. So I feel I need to modernise a bit there. They also need to think a little bit about the ability profile of a driver they're going to put in there, for want of a better phrase, in that they need someone who can, even if it's at a lower level, replicate the kind of thing that Verstappen can do, who can deal with the kind of car balance characteristics that he wants. Because we talk about driving styles, but often another way of looking at it is its tolerances, isn't it? Because that pointy, if you do get the car back to being ideal for him and it's pointy, that's the quickest way on paper for a racing car to be, if you can handle it. Because it requires like massive instantaneous calculations and precision to actually control it. And that's going to be the fastest way. So you need a driver who can at least do that to a slightly lower level consistently without it massively containing them. So they need to think massively about what they're going to do. But I suppose the interesting question is, Scott, is how long does Tsunoda have, not necessarily before he's dropped, but before Red Bull think, actually, we don't think, if Yuki isn't delivering at the level they want, we don't think he's the driver for next year. At what point do they then start looking around elsewhere and think, do you know what, we're not just going to keep throwing the next cab off the rank in our scheme. We're going to actually try and bring in someone we select and think will work. Because that's the problem. They're going to have one eye on the future almost straight away, even though they're obviously hoping that Tsunoda will be able to deliver.
Of course they will. They didn't want to put him in the car. They don't want this driver in their team. Like, if they I do not buy for a second the argument put forward by Marko that Tsunoda's a different driver or a different person this year. I don't see any evidence of it versus the back end of last year. That to do that is a complete rewriting of history to justify why you overlooked him at the end of last year anyway. Yuki's strengths and weaknesses right now remain the same. The weaknesses aren't as pronounced as Red Bull made out at the end of last year. The strengths haven't, as far as I can tell, haven't got any better, in the sense that he was already performing to a very good level at the end of last year, right? What's changed is they've lost complete faith in Lawson being able to do it, and they're scrambling because the car's not as much better as they hoped it would be. I think they've put all their eggs in the basket of... Actually, I'll rephrase that. I think they've split their eggs evenly between two baskets. One, that Lawson will be at the upper end of what they could possibly hope for from him. And I will say hope, not expect, because I do genuinely believe they were taking a punt on him. And then the other half of their eggs are in the basket of the RB21 would be so much better than RB20 that it would be more user-friendly, a bit kinder to the drivers, and therefore Lawson would slot in and would be able to adapt to it, because he wouldn't be dealing with all of the vices that have caught out Perez in the past and whatnot. And neither of those things have come off. So now they're in a situation where they have to put Tsunoda in, basically while kind of under duress, because it's the circumstances that have dictated it. So if he goes in and struggles, they'll make another change this year. I would genuinely not be surprised if they make another driver change this year. And if Lawson... to pick up on something I think Nelson mentioned before, if Lawson steps into Racing Bulls, which is, a good midfield car, looks nice and compliant, he's had moments of impressing quite well there in the past, and he's beating Tsunoda again, and he rebuilds his confidence, and all of a sudden we get to the summer break where, and this is the point I made at the end of last year, Lawson will have twice as much experience in F1 as he had when Red Bull picked him at the end of last year. I can see them putting Lawson back in the car if he's absolutely flying and Tsunoda's struggling. And I think that's the only move that they can really make, unless Hadjar is having such a good season they decide to do an Alex Albon in 2019 and put him in halfway through his rookie year. And look how well that worked out for Red Bull and Albon overall. Like, I can't see where they can go, because all of the other options they could have considered and did consider, Carlos Sainz, Albon, bringing him back, for example, they're under lock and key elsewhere. You're not going to get hold of them during the season.
And then there's the problem of the what if Verstappen leaves, because we're not talking about championship winning caliber drivers here. And who wants to step into this mess? If that is the case, they should have signed Sainz last year, have a backup plan, and have two drivers with a lot of experience. And they didn't. So there you go.
I think it underlines how much, we've used this phrase about Verstappen a couple of times, he's papering over the cracks, because everything's just built around desperately hanging on to him. But I almost feel like that desperation to hang on to him is leading to questionable decision-making processes in other areas that is actually reducing the chance of hanging on to him in the long term, because it's felt like a question of when rather than if he moves on in some way, shape and form. I know you can say that about any driver, any team, but it does feel like it's just a question of timing. So I feel like they also need to think about this team as a whole rather than just this team as a Verstappen team, to ensure that they've got some kind of sort of medium-term future.
Well, you say the Verstappen team, but different to the Schumacher-Ferrari era, it doesn't feel that desperation to hang on to him translates into decision-making power. Because I don't get the feeling they wanted to get rid of Lawson at all. I don't get the feeling last year they really wanted to get rid of Checo, or that they did it, that they said no to Sainz. I don't believe that at all. So there are decisions being made that he's not comfortable with, whether it's the car or the driver next to him. So that desperation, yes, but they're not listening to him. That's for sure.
Well, I think there's some second guessing of what they should or should not do with him. It's an absurd situation, isn't it, Scott? Now, nobody is going to argue that if you've got Verstappen, yes, you try and run your team around him, you make the most of him because he's an all-time great driver. That bit's fine, but just doing it in such a weird way is really, really baffling. And again, just speaks to the wider problems they've got in the back. It feels like they've just got to really get a hold of this team, because it's just wavering on so many fronts.
Yeah, it feels almost like it's more low key, because obviously at the start of last year it erupted in a very big way off track, with Horner's personal controversy, the Marco situation. It feels absurd that we're 12 months on now from Marco openly saying on television at the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix that he was having a meeting and he didn't know if he was going to get fired from Red Bull. Max coming out and saying, if Marco goes, I'll go, basically. You remember him throwing his weight behind Marco in a way that he just wouldn't with Horner. So you had all of this going on, which was very much crisis territory, but it was very, very public and in your face. Now it actually feels like it's the same, if not a bit worse, but it's happening a lot more behind the scenes, because you're just seeing, regardless of how much they try and play it down, an exodus of top talent. You know, Newey going, Wheatley going, Rob Marshall going. You've got a totally faltering driver system. So whether you say Horner's in charge of the team management, Marco's in charge of the junior stuff in sort of totality, even though Rocky, as Ed mentioned, is sort of trying to repurpose the way it actually works, Marco still has control. So you're blundering on both of those. And at the same time, you don't really know how to play the Verstappen situation, because you've got Max and then you've got the Verstappen camp. And those are two different entities with two completely contrasting ways of going about things in reality. Like, Max is just so no nonsense, zero interest in politics, wants to just get his head down and get on with things, but is just willing to be incredibly blunt and scathing if he thinks it needs it. You know, all of this is going on. So you're right. It does feel like it just feels like there's a bit of ambling in terms of the direction the team's on. that it feels very meandery as a course, whereas it kind of, Mateschitz wasn't hands-on, and Mateschitz wasn't the sort of total visionary who just went, this is what I want to achieve, you guys go out and do it. But he facilitated that kind of collective North Star almost, because you had Horner, Marco, then the people running the actual trackside team. So that's why like people like Wheatley and Monaghan became so significant. Newey on the technical side. It just did feel, didn't it? Like everything sort of came together and they knew where they were aiming for. So it just kept working. But unfortunately, that's worked until it hasn't. And now I feel like the lack of overall out and out leader is really starting to hurt Red Bull.
I think it says a lot about Red Bull's scenario and their situation that regardless of how well Yuki Tsunoda does, it still reflects terribly on the team. Because if he thrives, it shows they were wrong not to promote him in the first place. If he fails, then what's the point of making this change? So it's just an astounding situation. But through that all, Yuki Tsunoda's got to try and make something of it. And it'd be fantastic, I think, for F1 if he did, because he's a popular character. He's a driver with a lot of ability. And he's had some difficult times since he's been in that second team. So I feel like he's a bit more battle-hardened than any of the other Red Bull juniors who've gone in. Obviously, Perez is the exception, but that's what he's going to have to pin his hopes on, isn't it, Nelson? That he's got that little bit of extra experience, that he's probably got nothing to lose, because I think even though if it goes wrong, he'd have got better results in Racing Bulls, he's not looking in a great place in next year's driver market. But this is an opportunity to get in a car that's towards the front and succeed where everyone's almost expecting it to be really difficult and where failure is the most likely outcome. So that could be career changing, and that's what he's got to latch onto, isn't it?
Yeah, and he's coming in with an enormous amount of confidence, because he started the season really well. It's just a strategy that has let him down, but he could have been easily fifth in the Drivers' Championship by now. He's super quick, and he looks at peace with everything. So whether or not this reignites him and makes him question stuff, or he embraces it in the way you say and makes something of it, but he has nothing to lose. He would otherwise be probably Cadillac bound, whatever. That's where he needed to look for a seat. So why not? From his perspective, why not? And that it starts in Japan, that'll make it more difficult for him. But he is the kind of kid that will take that challenge on. He's not afraid of a challenge. So let's see.
Absolutely. And that's going to be one of the big stories of the Japanese Grand Prix weekend. I'm fascinated to see how he gets on, and good luck to him.
Let me just chime in here, Ed, before we move on, because as we've been recording this, there's a Helmut Marko, his usual Speed Week column that has been flagged to me. So I just wanted to mention it because there's a great line in here about, obviously, part of it is the justification for the change. And regarding Tsunoda coming in, he says, of course, there are many know-it-alls who will now object. Why wasn't Tsunoda given preference from the start? That's because Yuki's career often had ups and downs. He didn't exactly have an image of reliability and consistency, but now he's made a leap forward in his development, including in terms of physical preparation. Tsunoda is now a real muscle man. I needed to flag it because it cropped up. I couldn't not read it. And I just think it speaks to the absurdity of the justification after the fact. This idea that Yuki is now some kind of bodybuilder in the F1 paddock, diminutive Yuki, who has absolutely improved his physical preparation. But if Marko was paying attention, he'd have noticed that Yuki did that in the first 2 years of his career, because he realised he was massively physically underprepared for F1. And to suggest that he wasn't the picture of reliability and consistency before, but suddenly is now 2 races into a new season is... that to me underlines everything we just said about decisions being made by people who either aren't paying attention or don't care about the facts and are then just happy to rewrite history to suit their new agenda.
Absolutely, yeah. It's you can't say the consistency's changed based on a sample set of 2 race weekends, because that's not enough. Yes, he's been consistently good through that, but that's not what consistency is it? It's madness. And remember when he was sent to not quite live with Franz Tost, but he was in the same apartment block as Franz Tost. And Franz Tost is the kind of person who'll be going for a run at 4:30 in the morning, hammering Yuki to do that. So that physical work went on some time ago. There's a lot of post hoc rationalisation going on here. That's evident in abundance.
Hi, this is Javon, your Blinds.com design consultant.
Oh, wow. A real person.
Yep, I'm here to help with everything from selecting the perfect window treatments to...
Well, I've got a complicated project.
No problem. I can even help schedule a professional measure and install. We can also send you samples fast and free.
I just might have to do more.
Whatever you need.
So the first room we're looking at is for...
Shop Blinds.com now and get up to 40% off with minimum purchase. Blinds.com. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hey, I'm Robert Vinlow, and I'm from New York Times Games, and I'm here talking to people about Wordle and the Wordle Archive. Do you all play Wordle?
I play it every day.
All right, I have something exciting to show you.
Oh, okay.
This is new. It's the Wordle Archive.
What?
Oh, okay, that's awesome.
So now you can play every Wordle that has ever existed. There's like 1,000 puzzles. What day would you pick?
Let's go back to my birthday. My first guess is going to be birth because it's my birthday.
What made you guys do an archive?
It's one of our most requested features. A bunch of our other games have archives.
Like the crossword puzzle?
Yeah, exactly like the crossword. You know, you can catch up if you missed one, which is pretty cool.
Wordle Archive.
Oh, cool.
Now you can do yesterday's Wordle if you missed it.
Thanks so much for coming by and talking to us and playing. New York Times Game subscribers can now access the entire Wordle Archive. Find out more at nytimes.com/games.
My default word is always bread.
Why?
I like bread.
Right, for the final part of the podcast, we're going to tackle some members' questions. These will all have a bit of a Red Bull theme. These, of course, come from the Race Members Club, and if you'd like to get involved and have question-asking privileges, watch our exclusive members' videos that we're doing all over the place, read early access articles, listen to our exclusive members' podcast, then click on the link in the description or head to Patreon and search for The Race. It's a great community, and we're really, really enjoying giving the members more of what they want and build more of a relationship with them. It's been great to interact with our many enthusiastic members. So the first question for you, Nelson, comes from Aaron Riley. In a universe where Max did go to Mercedes this year and Red Bull had Perez and Lawson, where on earth would they be? Not in Q2.
So where on earth would Red Bull be then in that case? They would struggle to get into Q1. They would struggle to get into the points, I believe, because Verstappen has been getting the most out of that car in a way we've rarely seen, and it would struggle to get into the top 4 in the Constructors' Championship, maybe even top 5. As for Verstappen, he might be in exactly the same spot, second in the championship, behind the McLarens, but in a little bit more calmer situation. And as to Mercedes, what we're seeing with Red Bull right now, just points at how calm and without blame and without knee-jerk reactions the situation at Mercedes has been handled. That is a big contrast.
The next question we'll throw at you, Scott, from Gavin Cameron. Are Yuki Tsunoda's radio messages still an issue? Or is it just that broadcasters pick the ones where he's worked up?
The broadcaster or F1 TV direction on the world feed will always pick up the ones where the drivers are worked up. That goes for all of them. Lewis Hamilton had a little bit of a dig, didn't he, on the Thursday in China, saying that, and the drivers always feel like they're the ones being picked on, because Lewis said that, his radio messages on race 1 in Australia with his engineer were nowhere near as bad as the abuse that Verstappen gives GP at Red Bull, which I would say there's some truth to that, in that Max to GP can be laced with venom. In a way that Hamilton's exchange with Riccardo Adami in Australia wasn't. But Hamilton was wrong to suggest that nobody ever pays attention to that, because there's been a lot of time spent discussing the Max GP relationship. As for Tsunoda, I think it's largely in the same vein. Yeah, he's one of the more emotional drivers in terms of the peak that he hits. He really does bounce off the rev limiter when he's over the radio. But they all do it to a greater or lesser extent. And Yuki's not like... They're not having to bleep out Yuki's radio every other lap or anything like that. It's just there are moments where, he does get very frustrated, and that's kind of how he expresses it. I don't think he will ever be an Oscar Piastri type of driver over the radio, but that comes down to personality. Piastri is an incredibly understated, very quiet character, almost introverted in the way that he goes about things. And I've spoken to people who have spent time with Yuki, who have seen him up close. Like in the nicest way possible. Like Yuki can be weird. Yuki can be childish. Yuki can be extroverted. That's how he is as a person, and I love him for that. Like, I think he's a really, really interesting character. So no, I don't think that they're an issue as such. but you can guarantee Suzuka, he will be under a microscope from TV direction. There will be so much paying attention to what he's saying and what they can, flagging up the first bit of feedback he gives that's bad, the first time he sounds confused, the first time that he does hit the rev limiter because something's annoyed him in qualifying or something like that. And it might not be Suzuka, it might be another race weekend further down the line, but that's the reality that he faces, unfortunately. Hopefully people can just be quite sensible about it in how they react.
In China, there was that message where he said he wanted to work the front a bit harder, and they said no, and he said, well, I'm going to. And actually he was right in that. And there was a later message exchange where they sort of said, oh yeah, we see what you're talking about now. Yeah, that's the right call. And I think the other thing with Yuki is because of there is a need with him to project as well. So that sort of shoutiness, I think, has to stay there as well, because he's trying to get clarity over the radio also. So you have to, I think, bear that in mind as well.
And it's a language barrier. It's not his first language. So to make his point known, he has to be very forceful, because he cannot use many words, because he probably in that moment doesn't have them at hand. So we shouldn't take that away. Piastri, natural English speaker. Lewis Hamilton, natural English speaker. So it's a little bit of a different dynamic.
The next question comes from Michael Amadi that I'll take. A crossover question to bring back V10s. During the early to mid-90s, Benetton's second seat was a revolving door, yet we later reassessed Martin Brundle's 92 season as Schumacher's talent became clear. Are there parallels at Red Bull today, and should we reevaluate a former Verstappen teammate? Well, on the latter point, I think that Alex Albon and Pierre Gasly have been reevaluated by their new circumstances, haven't they? Because they both established themselves as strong performers with other teams. I think there's a degree of parallel insofar as that element I was talking about earlier. Michael Schumacher was the classic pointy car. Others couldn't deal with it. They found it just too responsive, and they couldn't be precise, and it just dented their confidence, and they couldn't deal with it. And that was the case with Johnny Herbert, with Jos Verstappen, with the drivers who were there after Michael Schumacher, actually, Gerhard Berger and John Alesi in 96. They just struggled to get the most out of the car. So when the car is as Max wants it, which is that pointy responsiveness, they do struggle with it. That's not exactly what's going on at the moment, and I'd say it's more in the realm of the problem of if you're a good driver alongside an all-time great, one who can provoke the car to do what he needs to do, who can drive around some of the inconsistencies and problems to make the most of it, you can be made to look pretty stupid. And I think it's always worth keeping that in mind. What's a realistic level of expectation? So there are some parallels, although I think even Flavio Briatore at his most capricious would not have done something as ridiculous as the Lawson out after 2 races situation. And that's saying quite something, isn't it?
Unless he could make a lot of money.
Oh, well, yes.
That's probably, yeah. There is that. But it begs the question, what is a reasonable distance between Verstappen and a normal race driver? What would we all be comfortable with? 2 tenths? 4 tenths? What is normal?
3 tenths are the notional number that gets thrown around. But I mean, I tend to think of it more in terms of points yield. Because if you look back historically, I last looked at the numbers a while ago, so they might be slightly out of date after the last 10 years or so. But if you've got a second driver, let's say you're winning the Drivers' Championship with your lead driver, if you've got a second driver who's scoring 60, 65% of the points, that's normally okay. So that's maybe the threshold I'd look at. Do you have a calculus for it, Scott?
I don't think you can, because obviously it's so circumstance driven. That's why I was saying earlier that like the thing with Tsunoda, like what success for Tsunoda going into it? Well, actually, in the situation that Red Bull's in, the car that they have, the gaps that we've seen so far, how compressed the field is, it's not a total disaster if he's out in Q2, as long as it's a competitive Q2 exit. You know, you wouldn't accept that 12 months ago when Verstappen's on pole and winning the race, and that's why Perez became under pressure, because the gulf in not just performance but result was massive. You know, if the top 4 or 5 cars are split by 2 tenths of a second, there's 2 tenths from quickest to 10th place, and Max is 4th or 5th in that, then again, a 6th or a 7th for Yuki actually looks really good, doesn't it? Whereas, or Max's teammate, whoever it is, looks really good. But qualifying 19th or 20th doesn't in any circumstance, unless Max is also out in Q1. So I think it would be, I hope that Red Bull hasn't done this, but yeah, the notional sort of 2-3 tenths, I think, is kind of in this sort of ideal neutral state where there's sort of like a sensible gap between teams, and it doesn't, that 2-3 tenths target, I think, is relatively okay as long as you're not judging it in the context of the competition, because that is when it changes. And that is when you can kind of get away with a 3/10 margin, for example, if you've got a massive car advantage. Whereas there are other times where you'll be punished for even being a tenth slower. So I do think it's more driven by circumstance than just sort of a line in the sand, just pull a number out of thin air.
And I think in the short term, it'll probably be upward curve in terms of the progress for the first few races for Tsunoda. That's the first thing they'll be looking at. Right, question now for you, Nelson, from William Foyle. In sim racing, you can't feel the car move with your body and you only feel it with your hands and see it with your eye. Could this be linked to why Max likes the Red Bull the way he does with such a pointy front end, and why others who have not done sim racing at a high level can't get on with the Red Bull as they need to feel the rear end with their body and Max does not?
I think Max is incredibly rare in the fact that he is both world leading in sim racing and in physical racing. I don't think we've ever seen it to this extent, nor do I think we'll see it a lot after this. I think it's a different skill set, and I think he enjoys it because of the competitiveness and because it heightens his precision driving. And maybe that precision translates to what he needs with this car, but to say that he likes this car is a stretch. I think they're separate worlds that come together just in this case in one very good driver. But that pointiness, that need to look at the steering wheel and it already turns in, was there even before the first Simric was brought into the Verstappen household. I think this is who he is, who he's always been as a driver, and not developed in the sim.
It's also worth pointing out that obviously Max was prodigiously successful in karting, and he's still a product of the karting world in the same way that every driver is. It's not like he's honed his skills in sim racing and then made the switch. And in karting, you want that very pointy front end, throw the kart around, learn the kind of behaviours that come with that. And then obviously he stepped straight out of karts into Formula 3, a car that obviously had a very, very good level of downforce for a junior single-seater, but also very much there's a category of junior single-seater that is underpowered and overgripped. And I think Max kind of skipped that step and then went straight into learning the ropes on a car that was going to bite back if he got it wrong. And then obviously stepped up to F1 very quickly as well. So I do think Max's entire real-world education has kind of lent to him developing not just a certain type of style, but just an incredible toolbox as a driver in terms of being able to like judge when the rear's going. He has a phenomenal feel for how much to load up the front axle without killing the rear axle and suddenly being snappy. He's got, the sort of vague way of putting it, he's got very fast hands, so he's very good also at catching those moments before they turn into big moments and stuff like that. It's a reflection of his entire background, I think, as a driver, from the karting days, single-seater days, F1 days, and the sim racing stuff.
Next up, a question from Marbles that we'll throw at you, Scott. I'm not saying it'll be a regular thing, but it was eye-catching watching Max battle for just mid-table points. How long would he put up with that before seriously looking to switch teams? To be a true great, he needs to win a World Drivers' Championship at more than one team. Interesting message there for Jim Clark and Ayrton Senna.
I think if Max, if Max gets to the end of this season and is anywhere close to winning the championship, I think it will solidify his status if he doesn't already have it as an all-time great. Man's a 4-time world champion, for goodness sake. So, but I take the point. Obviously, like Hamilton's won with two teams now. Schumacher won with two teams. So it is kind of the go-to. But there's also something special about, as Max has pointed out before, spending your whole career with one family, effectively. So that would be interesting, especially because that would also mean he has stuck it out. And, he's shown loyalty at times when it's been less competitive. I think it will depend how the next few months go. There's been a meeting this week after China to sort of get on the same page in terms of where the car development's at and what the expectations are for this year and what direction Red Bull can go in. Max was part of that at the Milton Keynes factory. So Red Bull are doing everything they can to make sure that he buys into where they're trying to go with the car and make sure that he's sort of part of the process. They keep saying that he's working really hard with it. So I think he's going to give them a little bit of time just to sort of see if they can rectify things this year. And he knows there's obviously a big set of rule changes coming next year. So he's not, I don't think he's going to walk at the end of this year. I think the possibility of it is maybe slightly higher than it was a few months ago. But I can certainly see a move away at the end of 26, for example. That feels to me like the most sort of sensible move for him.
Yeah, by then he'll know who has the better engine package and where the opportunities are. So, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it feels like a big risk to pin your colours to the mast of any other team at this particular stage. So that's probably the rational thing to do. Right, the final question from Maltese Falcon. Liam Lawson has entered the long list of drivers unable to tame the second Red Bull. Which drivers on the current grid do you think could consistently get the Red Bull within even 0.2 of Verstappen's pace? Are Max's preferences and therefore development direction so extreme that literally no one else on the grid could cope? And I think others can. You're looking for drivers who, if we're talking about purely when it's as Verstappen wants it, that pointy car that you've got to take, you're looking basically at the upper end. You're looking at drivers like Charles Leclerc, like I think George Russell could make a go of it as well. So you're talking about those sorts of drivers. There are sort of lesser ones because there's different level of tolerances for that pointiness and responsiveness. For example, interestingly, at Alpine, Jack Doohan can deal with a little bit more of that pointiness and instability than Gasly likes. So that shows kind of he's a sort of a lower tier driver in terms of his standing in F1 because he's not had much chance to make an impression of it, who could deal with those characteristics. So I think there are options. So I guess that's the interesting question, isn't it? If you were going to declare who would be the best performing, the best possible option as a Verstappen teammate, regardless of team dynamics, which one do you go for? I'd be inclined to say Leclerc, because although he doesn't have that, it's not exactly the same in terms of style. He does have that sensational feel and adaptability, and he's a great manipulator of cars on the brakes as well. Yeah, we saw with Lando Norris this year already that he's complaining about a similar feel in the McLaren that he's struggling to deal with the fact that it is super strong at the front, but the rear will give way. We heard it in Bahrain testing, and we heard it before after in China, where he said the car really doesn't suit me. So I wouldn't go for Lando Norris. I would go for Charles Leclerc as well. What would you go for, Scott?
Yeah, Leclerc was the one that jumped in my mind. I did wonder about Norris. I think partly because I think he is quite adaptable and has shown himself to be very quick in different McLarens, but there's that little doubt of like the way that he wants to kind of carry more speed through the corner is going to get more punished if the rear doesn't kind of go with you. The flip side of it, you could argue that the other type of driving where you want to drive it in deep into a corner, stand on the brakes really late, and then do quite a sharp rotation, if the rear's not going to stick with you as well, then maybe that'll be bit. And I think that's why the way that Max drives is so unique. I think Max is very good at sort of doing an initial bit of loading up on entry, introducing the car to the corner a little bit earlier, and then doing the sort of rotation a little bit later once he's kind of balanced everything out and got it quite steady state. Is very, very unique. So Leclerc, maybe with a little bit more experience, Kimi Antonelli, because Kimi looks like the kind of driver who is very, very happy to throw the car in and see if it sticks and then kind of gather it back up. So there's not a lot phases him. So I'll be interested to see what he could do.
Well, before we finish up here, just have a special treat for those of you who listened all the way through. We're giving away a free month of access to the Race Members Club to the first 50 people who claim it via the link that you can find in the description of this episode. So if you act fast, make sure you don't miss out. And we look forward to seeing you in our community very, very soon. And obviously there's loads of stuff on the Race Members Club, all sorts of content. We're doing more and more on there. So we'd love for you to join us. But thanks very much to Nelson. Thanks very much to Scott. We're now turning our attention to the east, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the Japanese Grand Prix.
The Athletic.